Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego lived in Judah a long time ago.
All right, this is the best podcast I've ever done. We've arrived.
This is Yana, and welcome to Access Ideas. Today I'm speaking with Lucas Cantor, a podcaster, composer, producer, multi-instrumentalist, and speaker. Lucas hosts his own show, the Book Society podcast, which features weekly conversations with fascinating guests. Lucas and I are both hooked on great storytelling and popular history. And today's conversation is a great example of how rereading a book that we love draws us down a winding path of intrigue and ideas. Lucas has reread Babylon, Mesopotamia, and the Birth of Civilization by Paul Kriwaczek several times, and we explore the reasons why this topic is so fascinating. We cover thousands of years of Mesopotamian history and mythology, and Lucas makes some intriguing connections to Julian Jaynes' 1976 book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And now I bring you Lucas Cantor. Welcome to Access Ideas, Lucas. You're the host of the Book Society podcast. Tell us a bit about yourself and why listeners should check out your podcast.
Well, my podcast is not dissimilar to this podcast. So right there, if you like this one, you're probably going to like mine. But I invite a distinguished guest on every week. We read a book that is one of their favorites or a book that has changed their life or that they have some expertise in. They choose it, I read it too, and we talk about it for an hour or so. So I like to tell people that if you don't know what to read next, if you just pick any book on my podcast, you're going to probably like it. And I guarantee that if you pick any random three, you will love at least one of them.
Awesome. And you really open it up to fiction and nonfiction, yeah?
I don't have any rules for what you pick. So I pick the guest and then I tell them that the book choice is theirs. Usually they'll get back to me right away. Sometimes they'll get back to me with a list of a few books. And in that case, I just pick the first one because I assume that's, I don't really have any rules for what people choose. Yeah, I've read all kinds of strange books. I did a year recap, a few, on New Year's, where it talks about some of the books I just found and how I felt about them.
I listened to that. That was really good.
Yeah, it's I tend to have a lot of authors, and I also tend to get guests in groups. Like I'll have one guest, and then they'll recommend a few other people, and so I end up interviewing people who are sort of in similar life, career type places, all in a row, which is fun. Right now, there's been a lot of authors. We're going to dive into a couple of philosophers. Over the summer, I'm going to have a lot of poets, and it's all just because friends refer friends.
Nice.
And yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a really fun podcast.
Well, I can certainly vouch for it. And I've had Lucas on the podcast before with the audiobook reviews in 5 minutes podcast. And one of the ideas that he planted in my brain was the idea of rereading a book that you loved, whether as a child or a younger adult, and what it's like to revisit that book. And specifically, you have insights as an older person or an older adult if you read it as a young adult. And I couldn't let that idea go. I kept thinking about it and wondering, what book should I return to? What should I reread? So I reconnected with Lucas, and I wanted to bring this up again as a topic for a conversation. And Lucas picked Babylon, Mesopotamia, and the Birth of Civilization by Paul Kriwaczek. In a nutshell, it tells the story of ancient Mesopotamia from the earliest settlements around 5400 BC to the eclipse of Babylon by the Persians in the 6th century BC. And the author chronicles the rise and fall of dynastic power throughout this period. And what I particularly enjoyed were some of the references to myth and the comparisons to modern day socio-political setups and dynasties. So I listened to this audiobook for the first time. So unlike Lucas, I'm not revisiting it. And I listened to the audiobook by Derek Perkins, who is as close to a gold standard as it gets when it comes to audiobook narration, just impeccable. And Lucas, I'd love to hear a little more about why you chose this title, why it made such an impression on you to the point where you thought it was worth revisiting 12 years after it came out.
Yeah, I've read it. I've probably read it 4 times. I think also I want to agree with you that Derek Perkins, I think, is one of the greatest audiobook readers ever, and especially for history and especially for ancient history. He's just got the right voice and intonation for all that stuff. But I came across this book actually because of a podcast. Many years ago, when was this? I don't know, probably 2015. I think it was before I got married. So 2015, let's say. A friend of mine told me about this podcast called The History of Rome by this guy, Mike Duncan, who was just a professor who decided to kind of go through Gibbon's History of Rome and add his own narrativization to it. And it became a fairly famous podcast. I think most listeners probably have at least heard of it. And it starts with, in about 500, he starts with the Aeneid, which is the Romanization of the Odyssey, and tells the history of Rome that in approximately 600 or 700 BCE, one of the heroes of the Trojan War, so I guess it would have been 700 or 800 BCE, one of the heroes of the Trojan War ended up in that part of Italy at the bend in the Tiber and was a king, gave birth to 2 sons who were then sent out into the wilderness because they were prophesied to slay their father or something like that, and they ended up being Romulus and Remus who founded Rome. Right. So I thought that was really interesting. I listened to the whole history of Rome, which goes up to about 200 CE, and I just wondered, well, what happened before this? And so I read that other book by Richard Miles, which Derek Perkins narrated, called Carthage Must Be Destroyed. And this starts in Tyre, because the Carthaginians were called Phoenicians. So I think everybody knows. Not everybody knows, but Carthage is where like modern day Morocco is. And the reason that it's not there anymore is because the Romans thoroughly destroyed it.
They put salt in the soil.
Yep. But if you were to look at a map, you would see where Carthage is and where Rome is, and you would think those 2 cities are going to go to war over Sicily because it's right in between them. And that is indeed what happened. And the Punic Wars are, sort of famous Roman. If you know anything about Rome, you know that there were Punic Wars. And so Carthage Must Be Destroyed goes into the history of the Punic Wars and where these people came from. And they came from a place called Tyre, which is on the Levant. And there's a whole history of that city. And then after reading that, I thought, well, okay, how did those people get there? And that is what led me to Babylon. It is the earliest history we have. It is the history of Mesopotamia, and it's Mesopotamia, for I think probably most listeners remember from social studies, that it's the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates. More specifically, it's modern day Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, and it is where they call it the cradle of civilization. It's unclear whether that is literally true, but it is at least figuratively, or it's at least somewhat true as the cradle of modern civilization, or of our civilization, Western civilization. Based on
the historic record that we have access to now and the artifacts, Yeah,
and one of the interesting things, Paul Kriwaczek is such a brilliant writer, and he has this great style of sort of hitting you with really interesting facts early on, so it sucks you in. And one of the things he says is that if you consider history to be written history, then fully half of it takes place in Mesopotamia.
Because we have so much writing.
Yeah, well, because writing when they found these stone tablets, these clay tablets, it pushed back the date of the invention of writing by about 2,000 years.
That's right.
Yeah, we assumed until the 19th century that the Greeks invented writing, but they didn't.
Yeah.
So,
and I love the fact that we have all of these tablets full of school exercises.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about Mesopotamia, there's also, because this is a book about archaeology, and Kriwaczek wasn't an archaeologist, but I've read a lot of archaeological accounts of this period and of this time. And the thing that I think people either forget or don't know is that archaeology is incredibly political. And it's incredibly, this is why Indiana Jones was always fighting Nazis, because archaeology is all about politics, and it's all about establishing the story of your nation. And so when these ruins were first discovered, people were not inherently interested in them because it's ruins of a civilization. By people, I mean British people, because that's who was doing archaeology at the time. Yeah. Right. And so British people were not inherently into them. And what happened was they started, and they didn't know that the tablets that they found were even writing. They thought that they were just some weird art because cuneiform was a totally unknown script. So yeah, people weren't inherently interested in Mesopotamian archaeology, but what happened was a banknote engraver named George Smith, who had a knack for patterns, I guess, ended up just stopping by the British Museum, hanging out and looking at these tablets, and he started sort of seeing some patterns and figured out how to translate these tablets. And luckily for him, and luckily for all of us who are fans of Mesopotamian archaeology, and all of us who are human beings and would like to know where our civilization came from, one of the first tablets that he translated turned out to be something that looked a lot like a flood myth. And turned out to be something that looked a lot like Noah's Ark, the myth of Noah's Ark that we have in the Hebrew Bible. And so because that was related to Christianity and therefore in the minds of 19th century Britons related to their own history, they thought,
popular culture.
Yeah, let's fund an expedition. And so the Daily Telegraph, a British newspaper, actually funded the expedition because they thought this will make great copy. And that those expeditions are where we really started to find some of the interesting things in Mesopotamian archaeology. And I think that it was a Daily Telegraph expedition that found Ashurbanipal's palace. Maybe we'll get to a little later in the podcast who he was, but his palace was important because he had a library. And at that time, a library was, you know what, for your listeners, we should back up and just say what Mesopotamians wrote on and why we know what they wrote on. So they wrote on clay tablets. So they would make a big square or a rectangular tablet out of wet clay, and then they would mark it with a stylus and then bake it. So it basically turns into a rock, it turns into a piece of pottery. And in the Mesopotamian sun or sand underneath, years and millennia of detritus, those things are actually preserved very, very well. So once we deciphered the writing, we realized that we had records of this entire civilization. And we haven't even today deciphered even like 10% of what we found. So, so anyway, so that's how that's how the West ended up interested in Mesopotamian archaeology, is that by chance we discovered a myth that approximated one of our own myths. And then we realized that Abraham, the oldest character in the Bible who is thought to be possibly historical, lived sort of in the middle of a civilization that had been going on for thousands of years. One of the great finds in Mesopotamian archaeology, and one of the things that really pushed the timetable of history and civilization back, was something that was found in Ashurbanipal's library, which is in Ashur, which is the northern part of Assyria. And it's the Mesopotamian king list. And this was a list that is inscribed in a stone tablet. They also found one inscribed in a stone column. They found this list in several places, and it's matched more or less. So they consider it to be at least somewhat factual, even though some of the reigns are way too long to be actual human reigns. So I'm going to go through, I'm just going to sort of read down the king list and tell you little stories about each king. So
I love that.
So we'll start. So this is going to be the 5-minute version of Babylon. And some of these cities, you'll have to, if you just imagine a map, they're all kind of in what we would call the Fertile Crescent, and they start in the southern part near the Persian Gulf, and they sort of move north. So I'm not going to stop and position every city, but that's the arc of it. Is Uruk and Lagash are sort of in the south, and Ashur is in the north. I don't think we're even going to get up to Ashur, but so we'll start with the king that everybody knows, the man, the myth, the legend, everyone's favorite, Gilgamesh, who ruled the city of Uruk in about 2700 BC. And Gilgamesh is known to history mostly because a big part of his story is that flood myth that we talked about before. He tries to go to the end of the earth where the man who survived the flood, Utnapishtim, lives. And he thinks Utnapishtim has the power of life and death. And he wants to revive his friend Enkidu. And so he tells the story of the flood to establish who Utnapishtim is. And he goes there and he ultimately fails, but it's fine. Spoiler alert. But he gets there. He meets Utnapishtim, the ancient one. And Utnapishtim is Noah. And so this was the part of the tablet that they discovered that got them sort of interested in archaeology. So that's Gilgamesh. He was the king of Uruk. And then there were, I think, 4 kings. The kingship. So one of the things that the king list talks about is that kingship is bestowed by the gods and only exists in one city at a time. So Gilgamesh had the kingship in Uruk, and then it went to Ur, and it went to Lagash, 3 times. And then finally it went back to Uruk in the person of Lugal-Zugezi, who was a king of Uruk. And his name, a lot of these kings' names are Lugal something, and a lot of those characters. And Lugal is, it's 2 Sumerian characters, the one for big and the one for man. And so Lugal really just means big man. Yeah.
Right.
So
yeah.
he was less of a king, like, you know, he wasn't the king of England. He was just kind of the guy who could raise the army. That was who he was, right? And that's what they call this the big man era. And it's a stage in any civilization, I think. So Lugal-Zugezi is important because Lugal-Zugezi was ultimately defeated by Sargon of Akkad, whose name has been taken by like a, you know, internet polemicist today, but is an actual historical figure. And Sargon, from 2340 to 2285, ruled the first empire in history that we know of. He said that he washed his weapons in the lower sea and in the upper sea, which means the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. And he conquered all that area, and he managed to run an administrative state for a few decades, which is quite an accomplishment. And then many of his, and he managed to pass the empire on to his son, Rimush, who passed it on to his son, Manishtushu. And I'm saying these names just because I love saying them. And then Manishtushu passed the kingship on to his son, Naram Sin. And Naram Sin, you can see in my notes, I've written a little symbol next to Naram Sin. It's a star with some like triangles attached to one side of the star, and that is the cuneiform sign for the determinative dingir, which means that the following word refers to a god. So the reason that I wrote that next to Naram Sin is because Naram Sin was the first ruler to be deified.
Right.
And he and which is, if you just think about, like, this is a big leap, right? From big man, from Lugal, who is just, you know, a guy who is good at fighting, to Naram Sin saying, like, I am a different species than the rest of you. Mm-hmm. I am a god. I am immortal. So that was Naram Sin. It was an important development in human history because we, up until the 20th century, had god emperors.
Right. And this anticipates what we see in Rome with Augustus declaring himself appointed by God, and later in the kingdoms of Europe. This is a very common trope, but to see it initiated here thousands of years ago, and then that transition, it's an important list.
Yeah, Naram Sin.
To understand.
It's an important thing. And then, so we move on to Shar-Kali Shari, who I just like saying his name, and then the kingship moved to Lagash and was bestowed upon Gudea, who, if you know what any Mesopotamian ruler looks like, it's probably Gudea. And the reason for that, and Kriwaczek doesn't get into this, but the reason that Gudea's statues and images still survive today is that he insisted that all of his statues be made out of stone, because statues were typically made out of gold or bronze. And what would happen is, yeah, exactly. The next guy comes and melts down your statues.
Sure.
So he made all his statues out of stone, and you can still see some in the British Museum. And so you can see these are pretty good likenesses. After Gudea was Ur-Nammu, and after Ur-Nammu was my favorite Mesopotamian king, Shulgi. And Shulgi was famous for revising the scribal school curriculum, which is pretty important, and one of the reasons that we have a lot of stuff from his era and a lot of writing from after his era is that he really made the scribal schools important. But the thing that Shulgi did that was really incredible and strange is he wanted to establish himself as a famous monarch. He wanted to do something, and he realized, there's only so many other cities you can conquer. There's only so many people you can kill. My predecessors all did that. My great-great-grandfather was a god. I mean, how am I going to distinguish myself? And so what he did was he ran. And I ran literally. He celebrated a religious festival in the city of Ur and the city of Nippur in one day. He ran from Ur to Nippur, and then he ran from Nippur back to Ur. And it's about 120 miles, something like that.
Wow.
And so they said that he did it in one day, and that was what he did. And modern sports historians and sports scientists have looked into this, and they think it's actually possible that he did it.
Really?
Yeah, there's like ultramarathon. There was an ultramarathoner in Australia who did something like 210 miles in 48 hours or something. And, and you can assume that these people were in better shape than us. They had more physical lives than we do.
Yeah.
And so is it likely that this feat was exaggerated? Yes. But it's possible that he did something like this, or that Ur and Nippur, our understanding of them is different than it was in his day, and maybe they were quite a bit closer together. But yeah, and this leads to an interesting thing, which is the way that they name years. Entire PhDs are dedicated to figuring out Mesopotamian chronology because they didn't know that they were in 2095 BC.
Fair enough.
So they named their years after deeds that the king had done. And so
Right.
year 1 of Shulgi's rule was Shulgi is the king. Year 7 is the king made a round trip between Ur and Nippur in one day. And that's how you refer to that year in official documents, which is not incredibly helpful 3,000 years later.
Yeah, chronologically must be hard to determine which came first.
Yeah. Am I getting too excited talking about this? Because I really love this
No, I
book.
love how excited you are about it because it's the energy, that's what I can really feel the passion. And I'm intrigued as to how this has come together for you and like how these themes resonate with you. It's just amazing. But please go ahead, tell me about, why is Paul Kriwaczek such a compelling writer and researcher for this topic?
Well, I mean, for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that he's a Jew. So in theory, his ancestry goes back to this era. And so
that region.
Yeah, so he lived and wrote in the UK, but he is not from the UK.
No, he's not.
He was born in Vienna in 1937, and
So he's a refugee.
He had to escape the Nazis. Yep,
yeah.
He escaped the Nazis, and apparently there is in the Holocaust Museum, there is audio, I think, or an interview with his mother explaining how she somehow had to liberate their father, Kriwaczek's father, from Dachau before they went to England, and it was, so obviously very traumatic, and spare a thought for they fled Vienna and they went to London, which was like not the safest place to be during World War II. They had it's definitely safer than being in London, but definitely safer than being in Austria if you're a Jewish family, but still not by any means safe. So he grew up in the UK and he became a TV producer and produced these several series for the BBC, which right after the war in the 50s and 60s, anything that you could do as a series on a reasonable budget, BBC would do. That was pretty much their thing. It was they were the Netflix of their time. They just wanted stuff to put on the air. And so he did a series about the computer in 1980, which is really interesting to me as someone who writes about technology. He did a series on musical instruments, and he did a series on the life of Mozart, and among many others. But I was amazed to learn this about him because I'm also sort of a musician and historian. And I didn't know that he was. I just loved this book, and I didn't know anything about him until I had read it twice. So I just assumed he was a historian, which he obviously was. And he also invented an instrument called the Kriwaczek string organ, which is like a lap steel guitar, but it has this piezoelectric current in the strings. So anywhere you touch the strings, they make sound. So I think it was like an 8-string instrument tuned in whole steps, and there's a video of him playing it on somewhere. And it's I think they only made 2 prototypes, but they made it. And one of them exists somewhere, and I'm gonna have to buy it eventually.
Or reinvent it, remake it, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. He patented it, so somewhere there's plans for it,
instructions.
But yeah, so he was just a really interesting guy, and he didn't settle into writing histories until the last decade of his life. So he was a TV presenter, TV producer, and a musician until his 60s, and then he sat down to write histories, and he wrote one about Yiddish history, where he establishes that most European Jews actually descended from Slavic converts and not from the diaspora. And another one about Zoroastrianism, but his most popular one was Babylon, and the latest one was this one.
And have you read all of his books?
No, I've just read this one.
Yeah,
I didn't frankly know about his other books until I did a deep dive on him for this podcast. I knew he had written other books, but I didn't know all these details about him until I thought, I thought I should know something about him when I came on here.
So it must have felt uncanny when you realized how much you had in common after you read his book twice. And then you realize, oh, this is somebody who actually had a similar path to me in some ways.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of research for my own book right now, and I'm researching a lot of personalities. And the thing that I've realized is that I feel like I have something in common with everybody. And I think that's because most people are pretty much the same. So this is is that like the exception is that I'll read a biography of someone and not see something of myself. And I think that's why people love biographies, because you always can find something like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's partly because the people who are the subject of the biographies are like you, and partly because the people who are the authors of the biographies are like you. And that's part of the reason that Mesopotamian history is so interesting, is that you read these stories of these people and you can imagine, like, with a few tweaks, we're basically living in the same world that they lived in, you know?
Totally.
And,
Totally.
and they're having the same issues. At least that's what I thought until I read the book that totally changed my outlook on this book, which I'm going to talk about now. And
wow.
That is Julian Jaynes's classic, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Now, where did I pull this fancy title from? So, like I mentioned, I have a podcast where we talk about books, and I reached out to a philosopher named Megan O'Giblin, who I really admire, who wrote a great book called God, Human, Animal, Machine. We're going to be discussing it on my podcast. I don't know when it'll come out, but I'm having the conversation with her on a week from today, basically. And so I asked her to recommend a book, and she recommended The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Now, what the hell does that slew of words even mean?
Yeah, and please define.
So in 1976, Julian Jaynes, who was a philosopher in the philosophy department at Yale, came up with a fourfold theory that he outlined in this book. And I'm just going to talk about one of the theories, which is the theory of the bicameral mind. So your brain is divided into two halves, as everybody knows. And there is a little thing in the middle called the corpus callosum that keeps them separate. And language and everything in your brain is bicameral, which means that if the language center on the left, the language center is the one example that is not bicameral, which is what I'm getting to. If the vision center on the left doesn't work, the one on the right will. If the oral center on the left doesn't work, the one on the right will. And they're redundant, basically. The only thing that is not redundant is the language center. The right side of your brain does not produce or understand spoken language. The left side of your brain does. Or does not understand spoken language, but the left side of your brain does. And Jaynes's theory is that, you know, consciousness is a mystery, and where consciousness came from is a mystery. And his theory is that consciousness is the result of, let me back up, that the way that human beings used to think is that the right side of their brain used to actually talk to the left side of their brain. So you would hear auditory hallucinations that were generated by the right side of your brain, and you would hear them in the left side of your brain and be able to articulate, and that those were what we called gods. And so everyone had a personal god, and everyone had a personality, but they had no concept of I. They thought that they were just listening to their god. And this explains a lot of modern phenomena about how sometimes you know how to react to something before you consciously know what happens. And that's because it's your, you know, they say it's your God, or he would say that it's your God mind. You know, this also is echoed by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist. His idea of system 1 and system 2 brains, which one is really fast and the other one is analytical. And so Jaynes's theory is that all of these people that we just talked about, Shulgi and Sharkali Shari and Lugal Zugezi, had what he calls a bicameral mind, which meant that they were only listening to the right side of their brain, talking to the left side of their brain, and they believed that all of their actions were directed by gods, and they had no way of initiating action themselves. And so essentially they were unconscious until about the time of the Greeks, which is when writing became the primary mode of expressing and moving information among generations. And his evidence for this is, I know it's like you're not ready for this idea, and that's how I felt when I read it. I was like, I think that's how everybody feels when they read this, is that the evidence for this, there is a lot of evidence for this, but there's no first person in the Odyssey or the Iliad All of the
Right.
action in these ancient texts are directed by gods, and the same holds true of the Mesopotamian texts. Gilgamesh is the main character, but Inanna is the one who initiates the action, and Marduk is the one who initiates the action, and Utnapishtim is the one who initiates the action, and they're just following these things around. And the way that Jaynes thinks that this came about is that by rulers, big men, Lugals, would tell someone to do something, and they would continue hearing that hallucinated voice in their head, and that's what would make them go up to a river and spend all day setting up a fish trap rather than just wandering off and picking some berries to eat for their family, which is what they probably should do. So this is Julian Jaynes' theory. So in a nutshell, I don't know if I explained it very well, but it's something. And so rereading this book with that in mind really changed my perspective on who all these people were. I don't know if I believe this theory, but it is a theory and it is a compelling one, and I'm glad I shared it with you guys. But please don't write angry letters talking about how Lucas Cantor got on this podcast and said that human beings weren't conscious until the Greeks. I'm just recounting a theory from a book. I don't necessarily believe this or I'm a proponent of this, but it is an interesting thought.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, you reframed how you thought about this whole book by Paul Kriwaczek by thinking through the conscious experience of these rulers and how they made sense of the world around them, and the fact that they didn't see themselves as individuals in the way that we see ourselves as individuals. They were experiencing decision making in a very different way, consciousness even in a different way. They were experiencing it in almost, if I'm understanding correctly, as though it was filtered through this God mind. Is that right?
That they were hearing a hallucinated voice that was generated by their the right language center of their brain. And they were hearing it as a real voice. And there's also even reference in Babylon to an apsu, which is a little like totem. And Jaynes's theory is that little totem was a manifestation of your personal God voice. So you would hear your hallucinated ruler's God voice in your own head, and then you would hear your own personal God voice, which is the beginnings of consciousness, of having an idea of subjectivity. But the reason that I bring that up is because I think it's fascinating and fucking crazy. So that's one of the reasons I bring it up. But the other reason is that this history, the history of Mesopotamia, because it is so rich in some areas and so paltry in scholarship and understanding, especially at the amateur level, and others, is very, very fertile ground for cranks. And if you listen to, Coast to Coast AM, which is a show we have in the US, which is just an AM radio show about conspiracies. If you listen to something like that, they often will talk about Mesopotamian things and how this one thing that we don't understand in Mesopotamia must be this. There's a famous author, I don't know if I should name drop him or not, but I will, Zachariah Sitchin, who believes that the history of Mesopotamia is the history of aliens coming to Earth and creating humans in order to mine gold for them. And and this is like, if you with a really cursory and crude reading of a very small selection of the facts, you could prove basically anything, because this stuff happened so long ago. And it also doesn't help that because we weren't taught about it in school, it seems like something that is being suppressed. So it's very easy to say like, well, the elites don't want you to know about all this stuff that was happening in ancient Egypt and in ancient Mesopotamia, but here's what was going on. And we don't know what this word means. And so it must mean that it's a spaceship from God. And there's, so there's all these, it's very fertile ground for this kind of stuff. And that's another reason that I just find it so fascinating, is that the more you learn about it, the more those conspiracy theories don't make any sense. And I think that is true of all of that stuff, is that the more you learn about the source material of it, the more you realize that it really does seem like just people being people, and it just seems like normal stuff. And this is my biggest problem with Julian Jaynes, is that I think that his theory is brilliant, but it seems like it couldn't possibly be true.
Well, the way that I make sense of the conspiracy theorist is most of them, or many of them, have this religious background, maybe not necessarily taught in a clear-sighted way, but it's certainly in the ether of the consciousness. There's many evangelical communities. And so this particular region, this particular era in history, there is a ring of truth to it, or there's a ring of familiarity, I should say. It's not necessarily truth. It's, oh, I've heard this word or I've heard this concept in some way, similar to the idea of how George Smith and his friends identified the Noah's Ark myth in this form. So there's enough familiarity that it feels true, because we're always looking for that. We're looking for something that feels familiar because that's how we've adapted, evolved, and survived. And so as I was listening to this book, I thought, why have I not been as interested in this era? You know, I knew about it, but I was always drawn to ancient Egypt. I think ancient Egypt always felt a lot more impressive and interesting to me. But when I do connect the dots to religion, I think maybe I avoided this because it reminded me of religion and the Bible and reading Bible stories, and it was so boring. And I just thought, oh no, I don't, I've been there, I've done that, got the t-shirt. I don't need to hear any more about the biblical lands. Let's go for the good stuff, the pyramids, the pharaohs. And so listening to this audiobook, for that perspective, it made me rethink some of my assumptions about that this was boring or this was just biblical stuff that conspiracy theorists like to rehash and reframe into slightly compelling, mysterious sounding messages, narratives. That's my thinking on it. Again, it's a little bit rough and sketchy. I don't think I've solved, how do we get rid of conspiracy theorists? I think the problem is when you're only given a religious education, you don't have the tools to be critical of ideas. There's a real intuitive sense of truth and acceptance and faith without the framework to take it apart and identify common ground. And that is something that puts those people in a vulnerable state, to believe that anything that sounds remotely ancient and mysterious in it has just a bit of truth to it because it has these terminologies from this era, this region of the world. Oh, that sounds like it must be true. That's what explains it to me.
Yeah, so what you're saying actually supports Julian Jaynes's theory quite a bit, actually, which is that the idea that you believe something like evangelical Christianity for your whole youth, and that when you grow up and realize that that is certainly not, at the very least, certainly not literally true, or at least maybe not true in the way that you were taught it, you instinctively want something else to fill that void because your brain has been conditioned to want to believe something as ultimate truth. And what Jaynes suggests is that Ashur, which is the last kingdom that we deal with in Babylon, and they were notoriously brutal. And the reason for this is that he sees in their writing that they were maybe the first non-bicameral kingdom. And so they had subjective consciousness. And so they were going out to the other cities and killing what they believed to be, or what they recognized as drones, who were just listening to this weird God voice in their head. And so they had maybe a generation ago been the same way. And then they realized like, oh no. And so they didn't think, oh, we were listening to the right half of our brain. Now we have our own subjective consciousness. They thought these people are listening to the wrong God, and our God is so much more powerful. And that is why you see the transition to monotheism, is that it's a lot easier. Like instead of believing the voice of your ruler in your head and the voice of your personal God, you, instead of hallucinating it directly, you just assume that there is one God that is giving everybody directions. So, and that in Jaynes's reading made the Assyrians, the Assyrians just really angry at everyone else. And that's why they were so brutal, because they didn't see these people as human. And that's and if Jaynes is right, they were in some sense not quite human yet, the way that we would define it, which is my problem with Jaynes's theory. Exactly.
Well, it would have made, but it also establishes a pattern that we're painfully familiar with, which is the othering of groups, right? Up until our day, this is a common trope in the news and the media, famously in American politics right now, but hey, even in British and Canadian politics, and listeners of this podcast will be familiar with that. It's interesting to frame it in a sense of like, this is how people think, and they think incorrectly because they're hearing the wrong God. and then linking that back to the monotheistic trend. And I remember one of the things my classical studies professor said that always stayed with me was people didn't fight wars of religion until monotheism. Because until then, you just added the gods from your conquered lands. It's not that they didn't fight wars. There's always reasons to fight wars. But if you were conquering another civilization, you'd say, oh, good, there's some more gods for us to add to our household. Let's just add them, bring them in. We can use more. There wasn't a sense that there has to be a single truth. And I think that's very interesting because when you look at monotheistic cultures, that is always a point of contention with any sort of cultural or geographical clash, geopolitical clash. There's this intense, and actually one of the books that you mentioned on your reads from 2021.
Patrick Radden Keefe.
Yes. Yeah. So I listened to that audiobook, Patrick Radden Keefe's book, and it's all about the troubles in Northern Ireland. And that audiobook is a chilling example of how religious belief becomes infused into the culture, and it allows and enables combatants to see each other as non-human or less than human. But going back to James's idea, do you feel like there's enough of a logic or framework to what he says that you could apply it still and make sense of it, even if there's loose ends and it doesn't hold completely?
Well, I'll give away the thesis of my own book and probably the bombshell moment of my
Sneak peek,
upcoming podcast.
Everybody, you heard it here first.
Yeah, which is simply that I think that scholars have tried for a long time to find holes in Jaynes's theory, and they're not easy to find. And there's certainly one of the things that he says at the end of his book is that, people are looking for the string that if they pull, it'll unravel the whole argument. And I promise it doesn't exist. And I think he's right. Yeah. But the big argument with Jaynes's philosophy of the bicameral mind and the fact that humans weren't conscious until the invention of writing is simply that you can't infer someone's state of mind simply by looking at the products of their civilization and by looking at their art. You can't take something that someone spent even years of their life on and infer what their brain was like from that thing.
But writing is the differentiator.
No,
you're saying.
I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but you can't look at someone's writing and understand their mind either. You can understand a piece of it and you can understand a little bit about it, but there's no, this is just a tacit assumption that we have in our society that you can understand that you can understand everything about someone by looking at by piecing together the breadcrumbs that they've left throughout their life. And there's just no evidence that this is true, but we just assume that it is. And so I think about this a lot because I am the composer who finished Schubert's Unfinished Symphony with artificial intelligence, a task that is not necessarily even possible to do regardless of how good technology is. I mean, I did it in a way. If someone else did it, they would do it in a different way. There is no definitive finishing of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony because
it's subjective. Yeah,
because there is no way to recreate Schubert because he's dead. And even if we had more, and we have a lot of data, he's the most prolific composer in history. And if we take all of his music and try to create music that sounds like Schubert, we can kind of do that, but that doesn't mean we've recreated Schubert. And I think what Jaynes is assuming is that, well, we've got the Odyssey, we've got the Iliad, we've got Gilgamesh. We can infer from these three texts, and let's give Jaynes some credit. Let's assume he's read thousands of texts. We can infer from these thousands of texts what these people's minds were like. I just don't think that's possible. There's just this scholarly bias, which I don't succumb to because I'm not a professional scholar, which really wants that to be true because it is kind of the basis for a lot of classical scholarship. So you want that, like you make this assumption that, well, we can look at something that someone wrote and infer their state of mind. And to some degree, you probably can on a very, very broad level, but not on the level of understanding how their brain chemistry actually worked.
Sure. But I think also history is fascinating because we can often prove that certain events or occurrences took place, but the understanding of how people felt, their sense-making ability during that time, their motivations, that's all up for debate, and it is so subject to our own ideology, of which we will never be aware of completely because we're immersed in it right now. And so that's why it's so interesting sometimes to read historic accounts of archaeology or 19th century documents about finds, because the way that they perceive that find, that site, is always through the lens of the 19th century, discovery.
Yeah, it always says more about, I mean, history famously says more about the time that it was written than the time that it took
Yes.
place. And that's true for Babylonian history. I mean, the Epic of Gilgamesh was written millennia after it supposedly happened. And it probably says more about the scribes who wrote it down than it does about who Gilgamesh actually was. If Gilgamesh actually existed, we sort of assume he did, but he might not have. I think about one of the descriptions in Babylon, and I've read a good amount of this, is Edward Woolley was one of the most famous archaeologists of the 19th century, and he describes the scene that he found in Mesopotamia somewhere, and he finds what he describes as a death pit, and what he writes about is that there were several servants, and then there was a king, and the servants all came, and they drank from a vat of poisoned beer or whatever, and they all died. And there was one servant that he could tell who was late because she had everyone else had this ribbon in their hair, but she didn't quite have it in her hair. And what Kriwaczek reminds us of is that what Woolley found was a pile of bones.
Exactly.
Like he made this story up, and it sounds plausible, and it probably was a little bit more organized than a pile of bones, but essentially he found a room with a bunch of dead people in it. And, they could have died in a number of ways, and they also could have died for a number of reasons, and they didn't all necessarily die there at the same time. I mean, all of this these are all things that you infer by looking at an archaeological site, and they're just so stories, and that's fine. But that story probably says more about Edward Woolley than it does about the people who died in that pit or who were placed in that pit after they died. Who knows? And there is this temptation when reading ancient history to infer more than is really possible to infer from the text. I mean, it really what we have is a list of things that probably did happen in a certain order. And,
sure.
And I think it's fascinating. I think the facts of it are fascinating. I think the interpretations of it are I even think Zecharia Sitchin is fascinating, even though he's not right about anything. But it's interesting writing.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. And really, at the end of the day, that's the only important thing. Are stories interesting or boring? Because that's what we want to listen to. And these civilizations, they're dead. They're gone. They don't care what we think. It's really our motivation and the value that we place that ends up being front and center. Like, why does it matter for us to know about these civilizations or these histories? Well, because we make sense of them and they help us identify things within ourselves. And we love finding patterns. We're sense-making machines in a way. And I think this is why ancient civilizations are so fun to read about. And I use that word deliberately, fun, because to me it is a bit of an escape. And ultimately, it's about whether the author tells a good story or not, right? So even though it's ostensibly nonfiction, and I saw some criticism on Goodreads that said, oh, this is just popular history. And I wanted to say, sign me up. I'm all here for popular history. Yeah. I don't need academic treaties and research papers, although I'm sure those are interesting in their own way. But it's about telling a compelling story that helps me understand my own context, my own place in human civilization. Is that based on objective reality? Not 100%. There's definitely some leaps of faith that we have to make when we're reading about these eras. And I think that's maybe the most interesting borderland to investigate, is at what point do we back off and say, okay, this is pure speculation, and going down that path is conspiracy theory territory? Or do we say, you know what, we can identify enough here to say this makes sense, this establishes human behavior over centuries? Because that's often, like you were saying, the reason we love reading biographies is to relate and say, hey, I'm just like this famous person who seems weird and wonderful, but hey, we both like this bizarre flavor, or we both like getting up at 5:30 and walking the dog, whatever it may be. So how do we find that balance and feel confident in our beliefs when we are reading about things that we know have been infused with myth and interpretation and politics and all that goes on top of history and archaeology.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you said that it's a leap of faith to understand some ancient history, but it's not. I mean, there's no faith required. You don't have to believe it is literally true, and it doesn't have to be literally true to be useful. And things change all the time. I mean, I think about just to go back to interpreting archaeology and interpreting data. I think if you were to have an archaeologist, let's say that someone's getting a PhD in the year 2500 in the 20th and 21st century media.
Sure.
Right. This is their PhD focus. So, they've read some history books about this period. They've certainly know some details, but they're really focused on the media. They might conclude that from 1940 to about 1965, Americans reproduced asexually because there's no sex in the media between those times. There's no allusion to it. There's no reference to it. There's no swear words on TV. So that must mean that they maybe because cloning was coming around that. So maybe they did a lot of cloning and they didn't touch each other because there's no references to that kind of thing in the media. So it must not have existed. That is the level of inference that we're making by saying, well, they didn't reference the color blue. Yeah. In the Odyssey, so therefore that color must not have existed.
No, it's a perfect example. I love that. It was very recent. When I say a leap of faith, I'm thinking to make sense, you do have to accept, even with, it's not that you are saying, I'm going to believe this for all time and that's the way it is, but you're saying, okay, I'm going to buy this story about the person on their way to a sacrifice who they got there late and they didn't have time to put the ribbon in their hair because it's a good story. And it's not really important whether it is true in every single sense of the word, but it tells us something about the archaeologist, but it also resonates in the sense that, well, this is behavior we've seen in other places, right? Jim Jones and whatnot.
Well, I think this is like partly a product of religious upbringing, is that you can hold something in your mind as true without believing it to be literally true.
Yeah.
I mean, in a court case, before they adjudicate a court case, the first thing they do, maybe not the first thing they do, and I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand is that they have a hearing and they say, all right, let's assume everything that is alleged by the plaintiff is true. Is this a crime? Mm-hmm. So if everything you say is true, is this even worth pursuing? And when they dismiss a case, that's because the answer to that question is no.
Right.
Right. And so I think of history like that, where you can assume something's true and then think about the conclusions that would follow from the fact that something is true without believing it to be the literal word of God.
Yes.
Or believing it to be literally true. It's just like with Edward Woolley. I mean, and I say this all the time. This is an argument I make to Christians that nobody really gets, but I'll try it anyway. But it's just that, what I've tried to say this to many of my friends is like, whether or not Jesus really existed, you'll never know, and it doesn't matter.
I agree.
And they'll say, no, I know he existed. And I'm like, no, you don't, because it was 2,000 years ago. So it can be written down in any book anywhere, but you have no way of knowing if he actually existed unless, and it's the same thing with all this history. We could find out that it's not really conceivable, but let's say it's possible that, all these cuneiform tablets that we found in the 19th century were just a large scale prank.
Sure.
That someone did 2,000 years ago, but I don't know. It's possible. It's not, it's very unlikely. And I think there's probably archaeologists who would tell me that because of the way that the soil was, that it's not actually possible. But, even if that were true, there's still some really interesting stuff in all of these documents. Right.
But what I sense in you is that you're saying all this, but you love reading history. You're not going to stop reading it on the chance that this is all an elaborate prank. So why?
I don't care. It doesn't matter.
You don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why? What are you getting out of it when you're reading? What are you getting out of it when you're reading about history that really speaks to you? Because some people, obviously not you, would say, well, this is what happened. And this is the truth. And this informs my sense of self. But you're getting something else. And what is that? What is it that's speaking to you that's resonating so deeply?
Yeah, I guess it is the truth. I mean, yeah, I guess I don't. Yeah, I don't believe that it's the literal, or I don't believe that it necessarily is the literal truth.
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't think about whether it's the literal truth. I guess like that's not my job. I'm not a historian.
Sure.
So like I think it is the job of people like Paul Kriwaczek and the people whose work he depended on for this book to make sure that they're getting these details right. And those people are called archaeologists and you know PhDs, and this is their job is to get a really specific thing right.
Hmm.
And they have methods of doing it that, from what I understand, are very comprehensive. And I've talked to some there's a great archaeologist couple on YouTube named Digital Hammurabi is what they go
Okay.
by, and it's a husband and wife. And what she says at the end of every podcast is always ask, "How do you know that?"
Hmm.
And this is the scholarly attitude, or at least it's the modern scholarly
Sure.
attitude, is rather than taking an argument from authority that because Wallace Budge, the head of the British Museum in the late 19th century, says so, it must be true. You can ask, how do you know this? How do you know this? How do you know this? So yeah, I think that the interesting thing for me when I read history is to see the patterns and the broad strokes of how humans have solved problems over the years.
Hmm.
And I think that information is as interesting if it is creatively made up as if it is factually accurate.
I'd agree.
Because, listening to, Sherlock Holmes was never a real character, but how he solved problems is very interesting and intriguing. And the fact that he isn't
compelling.
and compelling. Yeah. And the fact that he isn't real means that you probably aren't going to be able to employ all of the techniques that he used in your actual life because he is a fictional character who didn't have to worry about, bathing or paying his own rent. But also there are some principles like, maybe try to be more observant that are actually quite
Sure.
useful to learn from Sherlock Holmes, even though he isn't real. The idea that you should treat people how you want to be treated is a great idea, even though Jesus isn't real. You could still believe that,
Sure.
and and the idea that that God is omnipotent but had to torture his own son in order to forgive humanity for their sins. It's just weird and insane. I don't get it, but people do when they get something from it, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but that theme shows up in other mythology, so it makes me wonder what's going on here. Why are these stories repeating this pattern? And I don't have the answer, but I think that's what keeps me reading history and reading mythology, is trying to establish patterns and make sense of them and figure out, do we still have this pattern? Do we still have this sense making of torturing children? Because I really hope not. But clearly these stories were passed down and copied and written by many people because they believed that there was significance there. So I guess that's what motivates me. And so when I'm looking at motivation, I always find that fascinating, is why do people enjoy what they enjoy? Sometimes it's obvious, right? It's like a dopamine hit, and that might be part of it for anything that we enjoy. But to me, it sounds like you are enjoying the storytelling and the sense making as far as patterns emerge. And it's not as important to you whether it's concretely proven beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. I assume that how do I put it? Yeah, I guess, that doesn't really matter. The stories of ancient Mesopotamia are interesting to me, whether or not they are true. Which, there's good evidence that they are, how do I put it? There's good evidence that all of these people existed and all of these places existed.
Yeah.
So whether or not the actual, and we have some I didn't get to the Amarna letters, but we have letters that kings wrote to each other from the late Babylonian period. We have a lot of stuff. We have a lot of evidence that is archaeological and that is pretty unassailably true. It doesn't, nothing paints the whole story, but
there's other evidence that is interesting in the sense that it echoes what we do today, or it anticipates, I should say, since it came first. So some of the medical documentation about how they treated certain diseases or wounds, in some cases, the approach would be similar, like draining pus or something like that. And so it's not so much evidence as, yeah, that's what you do to a human body when you've got to clear a wound. And not much has changed in all that time. So there's that thread that I always find fascinating, in the sense that we really have a lot in common biologically with our ancestors. Maybe that sounds so obvious when I say it out loud, but to read it in the context of thousands of years ago, it feels strangely reassuring for me, just to know that we're still dealing with some of these same mortal challenges of having a body and what it's like to be mortal.
Yeah, it's that's one of the things that I think is interesting about history, and it's an interesting balance between having those personal things, just medical texts that deal with the body, and then also just reading and then 30,000 people got killed in this battle.
Yeah,
where
as they do.
It sounds really remote when you're thinking about ancient warfare, but in every war there were individual human beings having incredibly intense experiences, that are just boiled down to a sentence, and then in year 6 the king, took this city.
Yeah, and that was it. They were gone. They were dead.
And so it is an interesting balance, and it's also overwhelming. And one of the other theses of my book is just the overwhelming complexity of everything, and that everything is more complicated than you think. And one of the things that I've noticed when talking to people about AI is one of the common things that I hear is that, well, I could see how artificial intelligence could do X, but there's no way that it could do Y. And in these 6 sentences, X is always something I don't really understand, and Y is the thing that I'm an expert in. So a doctor will say, I see how artificial intelligence could write music, but there's no way that it could diagnose a disease.
Or do remote surgery with 5G.
And I might say the opposite, where I see how our artificial intelligence could look at some data and decide what disease someone had, but I don't think they're going to be able to write a symphony. And it's just a bias, because I know how complicated it is to write a symphony, and I don't know how complicated it is to diagnose a disease. Whereas a doctor is exactly in the opposite situation. And, my evidence for, and this thinking, I think, is prevalent throughout humanity, that people understand that some things are complicated, but they assume that other things are less complicated. And they usually...
Like the Dunning-Kruger effect?
No, it's not. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect is that you see less complexity because you have a slight understanding of something. Maybe it is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Yeah, you might be right. That if you're, I think I take back my refutation. I think you're exactly right, and that is exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I have a couple things I still want to ask you. Do you have a few more minutes?
We can do this all day.
There was a point of contention I had with Paul Kriwaczek, and that is he kind of dismissed the I'm going to restart here.
Wait, was your point of contention that he clearly fucking loves Saddam Hussein?
That was a bit mysterious and quaint in a very disturbing way, but I just figured he wasn't around long enough to see what came next, maybe.
Oh no, he was. Saddam died in 2008. He saw the whole life cycle. Saddam apparently,
that's right.
said on his, it's in this book that when he's executed, Saddam says this is a gallows of shame, and I'm joking. He doesn't love Saddam Hussein. He was painting Saddam Hussein in the context of the history that Saddam was coming from, and that we Westerners didn't necessarily understand. So
yeah. Well, I think the comparison wasn't Nebuchadnezzar that they tried to compare. And so a fun fact, I was in a school play about Daniel in the Lion's Den, and we had to sing songs about King Nebuchadnezzar and dress up in that era of clothing. But that's the story for another day.
As a musician, I'm trying to think, what do you rhyme with Nebuchadnezzar?
Oh, I think one of the lines, it didn't rhyme, but it was it's cool in the furnace. It must have been something like that. It was just completely bizarre.
Was there a chorus of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego lived in Judah a long time ago.
All right, this is the best podcast I've ever done. We've arrived.
I'll see if I can pull up a photo. I have one of all of us dressed up. Anyways.
Please be sure to make that the thumbnail for this.
Yes. Yes. The prop grapes and golden goblet were especially exciting to me at that age. It was like, yes, so good. Um, I think though, what I was a little disappointed by was the chapter about the role of women, and not just because I'm a woman, but because Kriwaczek said, none of the societies of the era were particularly egalitarian, almost as a way of saying, well, it's no surprise that they treated women as chattel and almost another species. But here's the thing. In ancient Egypt, women had very similar rights to men, other than the professions, but they could inherit land. There was even women rulers, pharaohs. And I thought, if I were a historian, I'd be curious to know why that is. Like, why is it that Egypt stands out? Or conversely, why does that Mesopotamia and Babylon stand out for its treatment of women or the role of women there? I felt like that was a bit of a blind spot, and I don't know if that was just a lack of curiosity. Maybe he just ran out of time, but I thought I would want to look into that. I would want to understand why this other civilization, which is, and I agree with the term conservative, right? The ancient Egyptians weren't interested in progress or tomorrow could be better and more advanced. But why did they have this more egalitarian approach with women, which stands out as maybe anachronistic for the time? I don't know. But that was one thing I would have loved to understand more.
Well, that's interesting. I actually read that, and maybe this is because I'm a man and this is my own bias. I actually read that as him saying, like, he wasn't really talking about the role of women beforehand. He was just saying that Asher particularly were brutal to women.
Brutal.
Like that, yeah. And that, like, this was like, even in the context of women being treated as second-class citizens generally in Mesopotamia, this was really, really bad. Even in the context of ancient Mesopotamia, they were particularly brutal. And I don't know that he was making a comment on the treatment of women elsewhere in Mesopotamia with that statement. And I don't think that I'm not going to defend him. I mean, if you, as a woman and as a person who reads a lot and is very smart, thought that was odd, I'm going to agree with you.
I just thought if I were a scholar, I would know about what had happened in Egypt to a point, because it was around the same time and the kingdoms had some interaction. And I would want to know, well, why was it so bad here compared to others? But again, it wasn't.
He offers a theory as to why it was so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, the theory that he offers is that they were moving into a monotheistic religion, and that monotheistic religions inherently separate human beings from the rest of creation, and that that's not the case in polytheistic religions that are generally more, you have a god of the earth, and he says that Enlil was what we would call god biosphere, and that Ea was his daughter, who was the earth, and so on, and that when we get to Ahura Mazda is pretty close to Jehovah, right? And or to Yahweh, and it's a single God that rules the biosphere and gives human beings dominion over the earth, and that is all well and good if you're a man, but if you're a woman, you can't really escape your connection to biology because of because of childbirth. Yeah, because of childbirth and because of your monthly cycle that is
evidence that you are connected to the moon and the earth.
Exactly. So I think he does give a reason for why they treated women worse. Yeah.
That's an excellent point. He does explain that. And I just wondered if there was more of a distinct, like, he didn't really call out the role of women before that era, but that's a great connection with the monotheistic mindset, that it does create hierarchies. And it really does separate humans from other creation. And that continues on into other monotheistic religions. So it does make sense. And I think that fits with what I understand about monotheism in general. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I think that's pretty evident in monotheistic cultures. And the other thing is he does make he probably doesn't make enough of a big deal, but he gives a good amount of column space to Enheduanna, who was the first writer. And she was a woman. She was, I think, the granddaughter of Naram Sin. And she was the first named writer on a tablet. No, she was the first. She was a woman. She wrote a lot. She was very famous. And she was the first writer, I think. Certainly the first writer of poetry, and those were probably songs too.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think in general, I think the role of women in ancient cultures and this stuff is chronically explored too little. So I totally agree with you. And I don't know much about the role of women in Egypt, but that would be an interesting study, and it probably exists. I just would like to say for any of the Christian listeners, like, this is just my opinion. Like, you believe what you believe. God bless you. I'm not. I'm sorry. I know that I can be kind of harsh, and when I said something about Jesus doesn't exist and all this stuff, and like I understand that might rub some people the wrong way, and that's not my intention. I'm just anyway, like, you would think nothing of telling me how, like, what you believe and think that was totally appropriate, and I'm doing the same thing with respect.
Well, on that note, I think we've used our time well to entertain and inform and maybe confuse a few people, but I certainly enjoyed the process. So thanks again for coming on the podcast, Lucas.
My pleasure. Anytime.
If you love Access Ideas, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and review us on Podchaser via the link in our show notes, or wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. Tell your friends about the podcast too. Until next time, thanks for listening to Access Ideas.